Okay, so if we think back to what we covered yesterday, we went through Nagel pretty quickly. And I kind of felt like we had really gotten a pretty good grip on what the absurd is in Camus, and Nagel was sort of reinforcing some of that. So Nagel doesn't offer a whole lot more in terms of analysis of the absurd um, than Camus did, but he does bring in some clarifications in terms of how we understand the concept and suggests a different way of sort of approaching the absurd in our own lives. He thinks that irony is the correct approach as opposed to heroism or scorn or revolt or rebellion, right? He doesn't think that heroic attitude is needed. We just need kind of a detached form of irony to appreciate the sort of dark humor of our situation, the situation we find ourselves in. So, I mean, the way Nagel put it was that beings like us are capable of adopting two incompatible points of views. On the one hand, when we engage our lives from the subjective first-person perspective, we have to take it very seriously. We engage life with attention and energy, and we have to constantly do that in order to live life. And from the perspective of our first person point of view, our lives are meaningful affairs. I mean, we can't get by without thinking of our lives as meaningful. It's a motive force to continue to propel us to engage in the tasks that are set before us. And Nagel thinks from the first person perspective, and Camus thinks this too, is just that's unavoidable. It's the unavoidability of seriousness. We have to take our lives seriously. Yet what Nagel points out is that we have another capacity. We can view our lives from a different perspective. So we can detach from that first person subjectively engaged point of view and look at ourselves from the outside. That is, we can take ourselves as the object of our own perspective, right? So from the first person perspective, we're viewing the world from it's like a first person shooter game where you are seeing through the eyes of the character you're playing. But when you adopt the third person perspective, you're more like in an RPG mode, right? You are controlling the figure from the outside. You're looking at yourself from the outside, as opposed to from that first person perspective. And what Nagel thinks is when you detach in that way, what you end up seeing is that the reasons and justifications that you have for the things you do from your first person perspective seem arbitrary. It seems kind of crazy from that third person perspective. When you zoom out and you look at yourself from the third person, what you see is that the reasons and justifications you have for doing what you do don't rest on any foundation. There's no purpose or point or meaning in the world as such. And so there's no ultimate foundation for those things that you do, right? And that makes all of your cares and concerns from the first person perspective seem like arbitrary and open to doubt. And Nagel doesn't think that you should just, that's the real picture, right? So one temptation there is to step back and say, hey, there's no meaning or purpose in all of this. So it really doesn't matter what I do. Because Nagel thinks that you have to go back to that first person perspective. You have to be in that, right? And if you're in that, then you have to take things as meaningful. So from that first person perspective, things are meaningful. But from that more objective view, things aren't meaningful. Things are meaningless. And it's that confrontation which gives rise to this absurdity of our existence. And so Nagel thinks, hey, this is kind of an interesting situation. We have to simultaneously occupy both of those points of view. And no matter what we do in our life, whether it's a mundane task like taking an aspirin or pursuing some grand project, I don't know, political revolution or devoting one's life to God, there's we're still going to be trapped in the absurd just because of the kind of creatures that we are, because of our own capacity for self-transcendence, for getting outside of ourselves. Since we have that capacity, our lives are absurd, according to Nagel. And that is very much the picture that Camus gives us too, whereas Camus just thought that the confrontation was between the silent indifference of the world and the kind of aspirations of the self for meaning and purpose in life. So they're very similar. Nagel offers us some analytic clarification, the concept of the absurd, a slightly different perspective on how it arises or what it's constituted by. And then they have slightly different approaches to it. But Nagel and Camus are kind of, it's the same, they're in the same territory, right? And I think one way of framing the territory they're in regards to meaning in life is by thinking of them as pessimists. They are the pessimists, that they have kind of a bleak view on this idea about meaningfulness in life. They don't come to a positive conclusion. Their conclusion is a bit more negative, right? I mean, even though they offer this kind of response, whether it's irony or revolt, rebellion, and scorn, that attitude results from this kind of bleak picture about our prospects for achieving meaning in our lives. They don't think it's ultimately possible. Like, we never ultimately find a meaning, right? A meaning or a purpose to our lives. And sort of paradoxically, it's that recognition that there's no meaning or purpose or point in our lives, which kind of offers a sort of some kind of meaning or purpose, right, to that. But it's very mitigated, right? Because it's always in the awareness that that's not really meaning or purpose in the sense that we originally started out with, like some meaning or purpose or point to life, right? So they are the pessimists. I want to call them the pessimists in regards to meaning. Woolf, I think we can classify her, we can put her in the camp of the optimists. And that's what we're going to start looking at today.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, good. So Nagel and Camus, on the one hand, they are the pessimists of the group, because they think, like, ultimately there's no meaning or purpose in life, right? And we have to find a way to relate to that situation. We have to find the right attitude to confront this reality. Woolf, on the other hand, I think she's an optimist. I want to put her in the camp of the optimists. She thinks that meaning is something we can find in life. It's something that is, in some sense at least, objective. Something that we can either achieve or fail to achieve in our own lives. And Woolf thinks that this is a very important point, because all of us are concerned about meaning, or at least so it seems. To one degree or another, we care about whether our lives are meaningful or not. And Woolf thinks that in order to successfully navigate that state of affairs, we need to become cognizant of the fact that meaningfulness in life isn't just some subjective fancy, right? It's not just something that we make up. It's something that can objectively be attained in life. And then on the flip side of that, or the implication of that, is that if we can attain meaningfulness and in our lives, we could also fail to achieve it, right? We can live our lives in such a way that our lives aren't as meaningful as they potentially could have been. So Woolf thinks this is really important. She thinks, hey, we've got to understand that meaning isn't just some arbitrary aspect of our psychologies. It's actually sort of built into the universe in some sense, in an objective way. Now, what Woolf means by that, it's a very difficult position to get a grasp on. The first half of Woolf's paper, she kind of lays out in a broad view what her position is. The second half of the paper is devoted more to the philosophical analysis of how to understand that view. And so I really recommend getting the first part down. I think it's pretty easy to understand what her overall position is. But then she engages in some deep philosophical work, and that's a bit more nuanced and a bit more subtle, and it requires some careful consideration. So I just want to bring your attention to that. That second half of the paper really deserves some attention. So another thing that I find with Woolf is that students often have a negative reaction to Woolf. Not everyone, but I find that there's more of a negative reaction to Woolf's position than to Camus and Nagel, which I find a little bit surprising because Woolf is the optimist in the group and Camus and Nagel are the pessimists. But I think one of the reasons why students sometimes, and not just students, right? Other people who I talk with, I think have this sensation as well. That there's kind of a resistance to a view like this, because if we say that meaningfulness in life is an objective feature, that means that we could live our lives in such a way that our lives don't turn out as meaningful as they could ultimately have been. And I think for some people, that's a little bit terrifying. And there's a sense like, hey, who am I to judge whether or not somebody else's life is meaningful or not, right? There's a resistance to that because I think we're all very much accustomed to this kind of relativism about meaning, this kind of subjectivity about meaning. And if we accept that there is an objective dimension to this, I don't know, that is a little terrifying. That is a little scary because it means that the way in which we live our lives really does matter. There's something on the line in the way in which we live. And we can live in such a way whereas we don't live as meaningful a life as we potentially could have. And there is something a little bit terrifying about that. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why there's some resistance to Woolf, because if you accept that, that's true, right, you have to put a lot of pressure on yourself then. I mean, maybe pressure is not the right word, but you've got to think a little bit more deeply about whether or not the way in which you live your life is really the kind of life you want to be living, right? So I think there's a little bit of resistance to Woolf in that respect, but you can see like that's part of the implication of the optimist point of view, that there really is meaning in life. Well, if there is, then something's on the line in terms of how we live it, right? We can either achieve meaningfulness in our lives or fail to achieve, right? Okay, so those are the two camps. We've got the pessimists and the optimists. Woolf is our optimist here, and we're going to try and make sense of her view today. So we'll start out with just the distinction that Woolf begins with in terms of the question of the meaning of life versus the question of meaning in life. And this is a very important distinction for Woolf. Notice the title of her paper, The Meanings of Lives. You know, that's a very specific title. It's not the meaning of life, it's the meanings of lives. So what is Woolf trying to get at here? So we ask this question, right? This is often the way in which the question about meaning is phrased. What is the meaning of life? And Woolf notes that the question is often met with embarrassment, right? So in many philosophy departments, the tides are sort of changing on this issue, but like, you know, for the past couple of decades, more than that, the past 50 years or so, if you start to ask questions about like, what is the meaning of life? You know, most philosophy professors would have nothing to say about this. Say this is not really a question that philosophers really can adequately deal with. And maybe there's a good reason for that to some degree. I mean, possibly because it's not exactly clear what we mean when we ask the question, what's the meaning of life? Yeah. What do we mean exactly when we ask that question? It's not like what we mean when we ask what the meaning of a word is. You know, meaning when we're talking about the meaning of life seems to be something different than asking the question about what the meaning of a word is. And so it's not entirely clear what we mean when we're talking about meaning, right? When we're talking about the meaning of life. But Woolf thinks that what people, I mean, if you wanted to sort of just take a shot at what people are really trying to get at when they're articulating this question, it's sort of a primal question, right? So it's another one of those sort of fundamental philosophical impulses that all of us have. And it's just vaguely articulated at first. We say, what's the meaning? What's the purpose? What's the point of it all? Right? That's what Woolf thinks is being asked there. What's the purpose, right? Why am I here? What's the meaning of all of this? That seems to be what the question is aiming at. What's the purpose or point of human existence? Why do we exist at all? Why do we exist as opposed to not exist, right? And the answer to this question, Wolff contends, is that if there is no God, then there is no purpose or point to life as a whole. Yeah. So if you think that God exists, we've talked a little bit about this, right? We addressed this in Camus, for instance. Then it seems like if there's a creator of the universe, that creator, if it's this traditional sort of creator from theism, created the world like with a purpose, with a plan. If you think about it in Leibnizian terms, the best of all possible worlds, the creator creates the world so that it serves a particular purpose or function, right? And if that purpose or function is built into the world due to the intention of the creator, then there's kind of a plan for every human being in terms of how they ought to live their lives. You know, that's where scriptures come in. That's where the sort of ethical and moral codes of religion come in. Like, how do we live in such a way that we conform to the commands and designs of the creator? So if you think there's a God, then maybe that meaning is established through the intention of that creator. But I mean, it's been, a while since Nietzsche famously said, God is dead. You can agree with him or not, but the tide, right? The tide of sort of intellectual attitudes has shifted over the past couple of 100 years, and proofs for God's existence are not as convincing as they once were. And so if you are skeptical about the existence of God, then it seems hard to understand how there could be a purpose or point to life as a whole, like some built-in plan to the universe, some overall purpose or meaning. Okay, and Wolff agrees with that. She thinks like, look, if there isn't a God, then it's very difficult to make a case for purpose or a point to life as a whole. Okay, I think there are some ways of actually asserting that, even if you don't necessarily believe in a creator, but it starts to approach kind of a creationist view if you want to say there's some built-in purpose or point to the universe. Anyways, so Wolff is just saying, hey, look, if there's no God, then there's no purpose or point to life as a whole. So if we accept that, then, and you don't have to accept that, by the way, I'm just trying to, lay out her movement of thought here. While we might not be able to find a meaning of life, like what's the meaning of life? Wolff thinks maybe that's not a question we can answer, right? And so maybe there's actually good reason to not try and answer that question because maybe it's not answerable. While we might not be able to find the meaning of life, finding meaning in life, she writes, is at least sometimes attainable, but not everywhere assured. I think that's a very interesting phrase, the way she puts that. Finding meaning in life is at least sometimes attainable, but not everywhere assured, meaning that we can sometimes achieve it, but we could also fail to achieve it. It's not guaranteed that we will find meaning in life. And that's really important, this idea that we could either achieve it or not. That's a very important distinction. So Wolff thinks that meaningfulness is an intelligible feature to be sought in life. It's not arbitrary. It's not completely arbitrary. It's not something which is purely subjective. That intelligible feature there is my emphasis. So it's an intelligible feature in life. It's something that we can track in a way which is not just dependent upon our own psychological states, right? It's something more fundamental than merely subjective wanting or desiring. So a question then, so the idea here is, hey, Wolff says meaningfulness in life is something that can be attained or fail to be attained. And that's a really important point to recognize. There's a deep question here, though. If that's true, if meaningfulness in life is really something that's there independently of our own psychological states, then how do we square that with the fact that life as a whole has no meaning or purpose or point? If life as a whole has no meaning or purpose or point, how can it be that individual lives, individual ways of living can either be meaningful or not meaningful? That's a difficult philosophical question to grapple with. And it's the question that Woolf grapples with in the second half of the paper that I was talking about earlier, where she really gets into some subtle philosophical analysis. So how can individual lives be meaningful even while life as a whole has no meaning or purpose or point? What we're going to do right now is just try and show how it is that lives can have meaning. And then this bigger philosophical question about how do we square that with this idea that life as a whole doesn't have a purpose, that will come later, and we'll try and address that on Monday. So what makes a particular life meaningful? Most of us, at least some of the time, express a desire to lead a meaningful life. I think all of us have felt this, right? We want our lives to be meaningful. What do we mean by this, though? What do we mean when we say we want our lives to be meaningful? It seems like, at least on the face of it, one thing that we mean is that we lead a subjectively meaningful and fulfilling life, a life that involves some form of emotional satisfaction. So when we say we want our lives to be meaningful, what we seem to be saying is that we want to feel like our life has meaning. We want to have the sensation or the emotional satisfaction of meaningfulness. What exactly that means, it's a little unclear, but we can get a sense of it when we think about what we mean when we say that our lives don't feel meaningful. I mean, we've all probably had this sensation before. Even if it's just a particular task, you're working on something and you say, this doesn't feel meaningful to me, whether it's the retail job you're working, the repetitive task that you have to do over and over again. And you say, hey, this doesn't feel meaningful to me. What do we mean when we say that? Well, we seem to be expressing a kind of a feeling of emptiness, a feeling of dissatisfaction, like there's a void or an emptiness in the task that we are pursuing. And if we're thinking about that in terms of our lives, maybe that feeling could be spread out a bit more generally. It feels kind of empty. And there's a kind of nagging dissatisfaction with the way in which things are going. And what we seem to want when we say we want meaningfulness in our lives is for that gap or that void to be filled with some kind of positive emotional satisfaction, right? We want to feel like our lives are meaningful. We seem to want meaningful experiences. We want to be satisfied by our experiences. And note that a meaningful experience doesn't necessarily need to be a happy experience, right? Usually when we're talking about meaningfulness is deeper than just having some experience which we feel good about per se. We want an experience which is going to provide us with kind of a deep existential satisfaction. I mean, so for instance, if you might go on a hunger strike, right? That could be a meaningful experience, protesting some, oppressive or unjust conditions. And that's not necessarily a happy experience, right? But it could be a meaningful experience, which brings a kind of emotional satisfaction to one's life that it might have otherwise been lacking. So we have this dimension of emotional satisfaction, and maybe do we agree with that? Like that's at least one of the things that we seem to be looking for when we express the desire to lead a meaningful life is that kind of emotional satisfaction. Is that something we generally agree with? Does that make sense? Okay, so is that all we mean, though? This is the next question that Wolf wants to ask. And here, I'll put this question to you. I maybe even just take like a minute here, 30 seconds, and think about some lives. Just think about some people either that you know or you just know about, um, whose lives strike you as especially meaningful. So just take a moment and do that. I mean, I'm sure some people will come to mind. Think about some people, right? Think about some lives and the lives that you find particularly meaningful lives. Let's just think about that for a second. When you think of people you know or people you are familiar with, you know about maybe either through history or through your own personal experience, what kind of lives strike you as meaningful lives? And then feel free to respond if you have something which comes to mind. Thomas, go ahead.
Some people that come to mind, maybe someone like Martin Luther King Jr. or like Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, like the similarity here is that they have a legacy. They sort of like created a revolution where humanity grew and are no longer like, like oppressive or like racial towards one another.
Right, right. So
Maybe.
there's some effect that they've had on the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some
Especially on humanity.
On humanity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they've somehow improved the human condition. Their presence, their lives somehow led to a benefit, an overall benefit to humanity as a whole. Yeah. What are some other examples that people came up with? I mean, when you were thinking through this? What are some other lives that strike you? Those are great examples, but I just want to, I mean, there's a lot, which, I mean, for me, a lot which comes to mind here.
Could we say like people like doctors who save lives on
Okay.
a regular basis?
Okay, good. Doctors who save lives. Yeah. Yeah, that seems like a meaningful endeavor, right? Doctors who save lives, who help ensure the survivals of human beings who might not otherwise survive. That seems meaningful. Now, the distinction you make, I think the one is like, look, when we say we want a meaningful life, we seem to, what comes to mind when we're thinking about ourselves is a kind of emotional satisfaction, right? That's kind of what it looks like from the first person perspective, is that we're interested in feeling satisfied, like in having a sense of meaningfulness, a subjective sense of meaningfulness. But when we start thinking about other people, we say, hey, what is meaningful about those lives? What seems to be meaningful there doesn't seem to be the condition of emotional satisfaction, right? So when we talk about Einstein or Gandhi or Mother Teresa, these are some of the common examples, Martin Luther King Jr., that come to mind when we think about meaningful lives. I mean, suddenly we're not thinking about, Gandhi's emotional satisfaction. That doesn't seem to be what is entering our consideration when we think about the meaningfulness of that life, or even neighbors, friends, or family. My aunt, for instance, is, everyone in the family calls her a saint because she really is. I mean, she's just an amazing human being. And because of the way she relates to everyone in the family, the kind of support and just attention and love she provides to people, she's really an amazing human being. And she's not necessarily not famous or anything, right? But to me, that seems like a meaningful life. It seems to me she lives a meaningful life. And what I'm pointing to there, and what we seem to point to in conditions like that, is not the fact that they feel subjectively satisfied in what they do, but something else, right? There's kind of an objective quality to the way in which they live their lives. And it could vary in many different cases. So my aunt, for instance, doesn't do the kind of things that a Gandhi did. But nonetheless, I want to say there's something about that which strikes me as meaningful, which isn't purely subjective, which isn't just based on the fact that that person feels emotionally satisfied with what they're doing. And so the point here is to kind of say, hey, well, wait a second, there might actually be conditions about the way in which a life is lived that are independent of subjective emotional satisfaction, which lead us to make judgments about the meaningfulness of particular lives.
I grew up in Iran, and there are lots of actually protesters against the government. And now and then there will be there is some demonstrations, and there are too many political prisoners, and a few of them have been died or killed in the prisons. They live a meaningful life, but the problem is most of them will be forgotten
Yeah.
after a few years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I can count them as meaningful life or not.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. The idea of being remembered. I mean, yeah, maybe there is some dimension of that. But will they be remembered for history? I mean, there's a similar problem there. This is one of the problems that, you know, Nagel was pointing to in some degree. It's like, I mean, at a certain point, no human beings will be remembered. So do you really need somebody to remember you in order for your life to have been meaningful? I don't know. I don't know about that. I have to think about that a little bit further, but it seems to me that what Wolf at least wants to say is that, you know, from a certain vantage point in terms of the history of the cosmos, there's going to be a point in which we all are no longer remembered, right? But Einstein, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, you know, these still seem to be lives that we find meaningful. So how big of a role does remembrance play? I think there's something to that. It's also addressed in the film Ikiru too. There's a really important scene at the end of the movie where they're at a memorial, and this idea of remembering comes in. So it's unclear to me how, I suppose the issue is how long we need to stretch that out. Like, and even if there isn't anybody who remembers a particular life, I'm not sure the degree to which that might change our judgment about its meaningfulness. Maybe we can come back to that because I'm not exactly sure how to address that
Okay, thank you.
just yet, but I think it's interesting. So just the point I think to recognize here is that it doesn't seem to be that emotional satisfaction is all that we're talking about when we're talking about meaningfulness. Because when we start thinking about the lives of other people and not just our own lives, we start bringing in more objective features, right? Things which are independent of that emotional satisfaction. And maybe remembrance is a part of that, but there are other things too, right? There's a whole lot going on. And the point is, hey, it's not purely subjective. There's something else involved in our determinations about whether some lives are meaningful or not. And really a point here is, why do we think that any life is more meaningful than any other life? Because we do tend to think that. I mean, we tend to pick out particular individuals as being exemplars of meaningfulness in life. And how could we do that? The question is, how could we do that if there weren't some actual features of the life that we're tracking, that we're picking up on, which are leading to that judgment, which are leading to that kind of distinction? So that's what we need to try and make sense of. What are the other criteria that enter into our judgments about whether a life is meaningful, independent of the criteria of subjective satisfaction? Okay. So when we detach from our own personal point of view and ask ourselves what lives strike us as especially meaningful, what we find is that the condition of subjective fulfillment seems not to be the most relevant feature underpinning our judgments about meaningfulness. In fact, it enters into the judgment to barely any degree at all. I mean, maybe you'd say, well, somebody's life who is not subjectively fulfilled, maybe that is in some sense relevant, but it doesn't seem to be the most relevant condition that we're picking out when we do that. So what Wolf is going to do is offer us 3 cases of what she takes to be meaningless lives. Paradigmatic examples of meaninglessness in life. And the point in doing this is then to try and draw out what some of these objective conditions of meaningfulness might be that lead to these kind of judgments that a life is either meaningful or not. Or it's always a scale, it's always a sliding scale, I think. More meaningful, less meaningful. I don't think there's like necessarily a hard line in between those. I don't think it's necessarily black and white or a total opposition or dichotomy, but more of a scale, matters of degree as opposed to either or. But what we want to do is focus on what these cases are and what Wolff draws out of them. So by examining 3 cases Wolff takes to be meaningless lives, she attempts to extract the characteristics that make a life meaningful. The first example that she starts off with is the blob. And I've just brought in the text here to read through these because I think they're interesting examples that I want us to consider for a little bit. So let's look at the blob first. She writes, "For me, the idea of a meaningless life is most clearly and effectively embodied in the image of a person who spends day after day or night after night in front of a television set, drinking beer and watching situation comedies. Not that I have anything against television or beer. Still, the image, understood as an image of a person whose life is lived in hazy passivity, a life lived at a not unpleasant level of consciousness, but unconnected to anyone or anything, going nowhere, achieving nothing, is, I submit, as strong an image of a meaningless life as there can be. Call this case the blob." Okay, so this is the blob. What is it that Wolff is saying is meaningless about the existence of the blob? Why would we characterize this life as meaningless, according to Wolff? That's the first question. The second question is, do we agree with Wolff here that this is a good case of meaninglessness in life? You can take either of those questions, in fact.
Because the blob just sits there, doesn't really contribute or do anything.
Okay, it doesn't contribute or do anything. Yeah. So that's that passivity she's referring to, right? There's this hazy passivity, a life lived at a not unpleasant level of consciousness, but unconnected to anyone or anything, going nowhere, achieving nothing. Because this is an example, a paradigmatic example of meaninglessness.
I guess in this case, yeah. But so we know for sure that the blob just doesn't do anything at all.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I guess maybe I mean, who knows what the other conditions are, but yeah, the way Wolff frames this is like all the blob does, right? I mean, you'd have to imagine he does a couple of other things too in order to get by, but let's just say predominantly this is how the blob lives their life.
From like an outsider perspective, I guess if we look at the bigger picture, it's not that meaningful, but I mean, like, who are we to judge, right? I mean, like, it's human freedom, and like maybe to the blob it feels meaningful, and I guess to the person that's all there is to it. As long as the person feels happy, then maybe to that person he feels meaningful.
Right. So that's that condition of subjective satisfaction that Wolff was talking about just a moment ago, right? She said that's normally what we think about. And if you really think that what constitutes meaningfulness is subjective satisfaction, then you can say in a case like the blob, well, the blob's satisfied. That's, who are we to judge? Like, there's nothing I can say about that. The blob's satisfied in what he's doing. If he wants to live that kind of life, that's fine. If it's meaningful to him, then it's meaningful to him. Who am I to say about whether or not it's meaningful? But Wolff thinks like, hey, that's not actually how we think about a case like this. I mean, we might say to ourselves, oh, I don't want to be too judgmental, but we've got to like resist being judgmental in cases like that, right? Because we are, I mean, this is Wolff's point, that we are, I mean, this seems right to me, that we're picking up on something here, right? We're recognizing something when we look at a life like this and we say, wait, something's not right there, right? Something's not exactly right. Even if the blob is totally satisfied, emotionally satisfied with what they're doing, still seems like if you're just that passivity is causing the blob to not fulfill a kind of potential that he has. So yeah, I mean, those are the two, that's where we start to, the judgments start to converge. And I think the common intuition here is to say, yeah, I don't want to judge anybody else's life, right? Because I don't know, who am I to judge, right? What is meaningful and what is not meaningful? But I think intuitively, like we have a sense that something isn't exactly right here. Something's kind of going astray in terms of meaningfulness, right? And what Wolf wants to say is that it's that passivity with which the blob lives their life, which is the problem here. So let's look at some of the other examples. So the next example is the case of the useless life. So Wolf writes, in contrast to the blob's activity, for example, we may imagine a life full of activity. Maybe that should say inactivity. Maybe I have a typo there. In contrast to the blob's inactivity, for example, we may imagine a life full of activity, but silly or decadent or useless activity. And again, I have nothing against silly activity, but only against the life that is wholly occupied with it. We may imagine, for example, one of the idle rich who flits about, fighting off boredom, moving from one amusement to another. She shops, she travels, she eats at expensive restaurants, she works out with her personal trainer. Curiously, one might also take a very unidle rich person to epitomize a meaningless life in a slightly different way. Consider, for example, the corporate executive who works 12-hour, 7-day weeks, suffering great stress for the sole purpose of the accumulation of personal wealth. Related to this, perhaps, is David Wiggins's example of the pig farmer who buys more land to grow more corn, to feed more pigs, to buy more land, to grow more corn, to feed more pigs. They all share at least this feature. They can all be characterized as lives whose dominant activities seem pointless, useless, or empty. Classify these cases under the heading useless. So the first example here is of the idle rich person. She shops, she travels, she eats at expensive restaurants, she works with her personal trainer, and is basically just constantly fighting off boredom, right? Seems pointless, kind of empty. It's very active, right? So in contrast to the blob, who is totally inactive, this is a life which is active, but it doesn't seem to be directed toward anything. And the other example here is the corporate executive, who just spends all of their time working to accumulate more wealth. And once they get that wealth, it just requires them to do more work to continue to accumulate that wealth. And Wolf wants to say that these lives are useless. So, I mean, what do we think about this? Do these examples pick up on an absence of something that would lead us to say the life is meaningful? I mean, is something missing in these examples, in the lives, the persons who are exemplified in these examples?
I guess so, yes.
Okay, yeah, why?
Because they don't care about anybody else. They just care about themselves.
Okay, so
I
they
feel
don't,
this way.
okay, they don't care about anyone else. They just care about themselves. Okay, interesting, yeah.
There's also like they're not really trying to work towards like a goal that helps others but themselves, and in the end, even when they reach their goal of like what they desire, it's not really going to change the emptiness or uselessness that they've gotten into the routine of doing.
Yeah, so right, there's no sort of like purpose beyond the activity itself, right? And the activity is really not directed toward anything that contributes to some purpose or point outside of the activity itself. Yeah. So I mean, I suppose you could, I often find people try to change the examples a little bit. And like, what if the corporate executive, is like giving all this money to a philanthropic foundation? Maybe that does change it a little bit, but that's not the example we're given. Like, we're given the example of a person who's just dedicated to the accumulation of personal wealth, right? That's the sole object of their activity. And maybe in some sense you could say some of these examples are one-dimensional because most lives have more facets than this. Maybe that is a kind of an objection you can raise here. But I think we could provide Wolf the benefit of the doubt and say the kind of examples she's giving are examples of lives that are dominated by this kind of one concern, right? That's the sort of the salient feature of the life. And I think we can imagine examples like that too, like real examples of that. Okay, so Wolf thinks that's an example of meaninglessness. Yeah. The last one is, she admits, is the most controversial case that she offers. So let's think through this one. A somewhat different and I think more controversial sort of case to consider involves someone who is engaged, even dedicated to a project that is ultimately revealed as bankrupt. Not because the person's values are shallow or misguided, but because the project fails. The person may go literally bankrupt. For example, a man may devote his life to creating and building a company to hand over to his children, but the item his company manufactures is rendered obsolete by technology shortly before his planned retirement. Or consider a scientist whose life's work is rendered useless by the announcement of a medical breakthrough just weeks before his own research would have yielded the same results. Perhaps more poignantly, imagine a woman whose life is centered around a relationship that turns out to be a fraud. Cases that fit this mold we may categorize under the heading bankrupt. So what's the condition that Wolf is pointing to here, which she thinks would characterize the life as meaningless?
I guess in this sense, it's like wasted time, wasted effort, wasted energy. So you spent years of your life dedicating to this one project, and it turns out it's meaningless in a sense. But like, I think the distinction here is that the person didn't know, right? I mean, like, how could they have predicted that the issue would happen?
Yeah. So Wolf is saying, hey, look, sometimes projects aren't successful. Sometimes the things we do aren't successful. And if they're not successful, that makes them less meaningful. And you might say, hey, look, the case of the scientist whose life work is rendered useless by the announcement of a medical breakthrough just weeks before his own research would have yielded the same result. So the scientist is working for years, likely on decades, maybe even on a particular medical breakthrough, and then just weeks before he announces his own breakthrough, that somebody else comes up with the discovery. And so all of his work, no recognition is given for that. In some sense, all of his work is rendered obsolete because of the other breakthrough or discovery. And Wolf wants to say, hey, well, so the project wasn't successful, and that makes it less meaningful. And you were saying, Thomas, well, I mean, how could this person have known that? And Wolf thinks, yeah, I mean, that's part of the risk about undertaking a meaningful project, is that it can succeed or it can fail to succeed. And if it doesn't succeed, well, it's not as meaningful as if it did. The other example here that she gives is a woman whose life is centered around a relationship that turns out to be a fraud, right? So, I mean, someone might enter into a relationship and not know that it's based upon an entirely faulty foundation and only come to that realization later. But let's say you dedicate years, maybe decades of your life to such a relationship, and then ultimately you find out that it was based upon this faulty foundation, that it was a fraud, that the other person you were in a relationship with was never genuine to begin with. I mean, that's pretty devastating, right? It makes the relationship seem less meaningful. So Wolf wants to say success is actually an important condition in meaningfulness, right? It's a tough one. She says it's the most controversial case, the most controversial criteria that she's offering here, this idea of success. And I think one of the reasons why she thinks it's controversial is because we all have the sense that, hey, you've got to fail sometimes, right? I mean, of course, you've got to fail, right? If you're going to do anything of significance, you're going to have to fail many times over and over and over and over again, right? But you don't want to just always fail. I mean, the point of failure is to eventually succeed. And you know that in order to succeed, you have to fail many times over. And if it's just failure all the way through, you'd say, it never culminated. It never got to where it was going. And that's the kind of sense, the kind of intuition I think she's pointing out here is that when we think about meaningfulness in our life, we want the projects that we undertake to ultimately come to fruition, to be successful. And it doesn't necessarily have to have like a world-renowned recognition. I mean, just a relationship can be an example of a successful project, right? You don't need to be recognized by millions of people, right? But if it's not successful, then that makes the project less meaningful. So what is it about these lives that Wolf finds meaningless? The blob. The blob's life is passive. The idle rich person or the corporate executive, their life is useless, right? Their activity is useless, we'll say, not their life, their activity. And then finally, the bankrupt project, which is unsuccessful. Okay, so she says, look, these are what make those particular examples cases of meaningless lives. Yeah. So those are the 3 cases of meaningless lives. And she thinks that this points us to the positive criteria that we need in order to judge a life as meaningful, and often what we do use when we make those judgments about meaningful lives that we were spending so much time at the beginning talking about. When we think about other people and whether or not their lives are meaningful, Wolf thinks that these are the criteria that we're bringing to bear in our judgment. So she says, in order for a life to count as meaningful, it must be a life that is, 1, engaged, right? So in contrast to the blob, the life has to be engaged, actively engaged. But it can't be engaged in just anything, right? Because we saw in the case of the idle rich person and the corporate executive, those are engaged lives, but they're engaged in useless activities. So she says the life needs to be engaged, but not in just anything. It needs to be engaged in a project of positive value. Yeah. The life needs to be engaged in a project of positive value. And third, it needs to be to some degree successful. So these are the criteria that Wolf thinks we're using when we judge a life to be either meaningful or not meaningful. Is the life engaged? Is it engaged in a project of positive value? And is it to some degree successful? Right, those are the 3 criteria that Wolf thinks need to be met in order for the life to attain to meaningfulness. And notice she says to some degree successful. I think the case of the bankrupt project is a really interesting one. What is the level of success that we need? I don't know. That's a tough question, right? It's similar to the question, to what degree do you need to be remembered, right? In order for what you have done to be meaningful. The success of the project can be thought about in a number of different ways. And so these criteria are very broad, right? They cover a lot of ground. They even cover seemingly distinct types of projects. And that's something we'll talk about in just a bit. Might need to get to that next week. Johnny, go ahead.
So the blob is living, I was just thinking, he's living a meaningless life. But what if the blob had a child, right? And the child would see the blob day in and day out, and that led the child to strive for a meaningful life. So in essence, the blob contributed or did have some meaning to pushing their child to be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So in a case like that, we'd want to say, hey, the blob's life wasn't completely meaningless because they indirectly contributed to somebody else leading a meaningful life by setting the kind of negative example, like don't be like that, right? There's a lot of people in life where we say, hey, don't be like that. Like that's a good example of how not to live. Um, and while you might think, well, hey, maybe that's necessary to some degree, does that really make us say that the life the blob has lived was meaningful in the sense that we commonly, I mean, is the blob the kind of life we're going to pick out when we start scanning for the people that we know who live meaningful lives or who we know have heard about, right? It doesn't seem to be the kind of life we pick out as an example, as a paradigmatic example of meaningfulness. I mean, you might say, hey, yeah, they have contributed something. I mean, it's not that Wolf isn't saying because somebody's life isn't meaningful, it doesn't have any value at all, right? It just doesn't seem to be the kind of life that we say, hey, that's an example of a meaningful life. That's the kind of life I want to attain to, right? I mean, most people don't set up someone like the blob or the example of the person you say, don't be like that. We just aspire not to live that way, right? So it's a negative example. It's an example of what not to do. It's an example of not being meaningful. And that's why the child would have the judgment, right? To go on the path that they do go is they say, hey, that's an example of not being meaningful. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do it in the other way, right? Because that seems to not be a meaningful existence. So I think even in that example, you have the case of the child coming up with the judgment that life isn't meaningful, which is saying, and then leads them to say, hey, I don't want my life to be that way. I want my life to be meaningful, right?
Question.
Yeah.
What about intent
Mhm.
in the person's actions? Does that factor into the criteria? For example, if a person did not intend to do a meaningful action, but yet it resorts in something meaningful, did that person live a meaningful life?
So what would be an example of that?
Well, I guess the blob. Like the blob doesn't intend probably for the child to become a meaningful person, but through the blob's actions, the child ends up living a meaningful life.
Uh-huh. Okay, so but in that case, is it because of the blob? I mean, is it really because of the blob that the child lives a meaningful life? So you might say maybe that's a relevant factor to some degree, but I mean, the child has to go on to live their life, right? They're the one who's going to go on to live the meaningful life. So it's something about, isn't it something about their life that we're saying, hey, and maybe the blob contributed to that in some way, even if unintentionally. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like the blob in that case, though, fulfills these criteria. It's not engaged, right? It's not purposefully trying to do that. The project that the blob has taken they haven't undertaken a project, right? There is no project there of positive value. Just kind of, yeah, maybe it comes about by happenstance that they have this indirect effect on somebody. Is their life successful? I mean, could you really say it's successful if they didn't intend it for that to happen? I mean, it doesn't seem like we'd want to say, yes, the blob succeeded. The blob succeeded in their project of helping the child live a meaningful life, because that just seems to be a side effect of the activity that they have undertaken.
I want to add, like, I guess you can say that the blob could yield the same results if he lived a meaningful life himself. Like it would inspire his child. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like a win-win situation in a
Yeah.
sense, I guess.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah. So in that case, you can say, hey, the blob contributed to the meaningful life of their child, and they lived a meaningful life because they set a positive example about how to live, right? I mean, in that case, it might even be a part of the blob's project to provide a good example for the child about how to live their lives. And if they were successful, I mean, you can think about that. That's a project, right? Being a parent is a project. And you can be a good parent or a bad parent, right? I think that's something we could probably agree on. Some parents are terrible, and in some cases that can lead to the child choosing to do something different and leading the life of their own, which is positive. But in other cases, right, somebody who embraces that project, who engages it, knows and puts their heart into it and is successful, like we judge a life like that very differently, I think.
I was thinking about the same thing. I was thinking about housewife or a devoted mother that taking care of the kids and
Yeah.
direct them to the right route. I was thinking about that example.
Yeah. I mean, we judge a person who just doesn't pay attention to their children, right? Who disregards them very differently than somebody who is actively involved in their child's life. And you might even say, hey, I mean, there's going to be some degree of success there. Parenting, that's tough, right? That is a tough job. And you've got to allow some room for success there. And so again, this is sort of a sliding scale. I don't want to suggest that Wolf is saying it's either meaningful or it's not meaningful. The examples are stark to help conceptualize what's going on here. But somebody who just isn't engaged at all in the life of their child, right? We say, well, you're not, that's a problem, right? For that particular kind of project.
I was just thinking about like the blob and how what if in like before he got into that routine of not doing anything and just living passively, he was maybe like in the military or something, and he saved a lot of people, and like those people still remember them as like someone that was really great and did so many like amazing things, but because of like trauma that he experienced, he just got into this like routine, right?
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes people that kind of I don't know how to word this, but like if you had a big impact, like even though it was just a short, like it wasn't through a long or like it was a short period in your life that caused this big impact, while like all the rest was like not as meaningful, does it your life like would that still be considered like meaningful
Yeah, well, I think no, it's good, but I think it's so Wolf is going to say, well, if something happened to the person, right? I mean, if they were living an engaged life and a project that was of positive value to some degree successful, and then later something happened to them and they turned into the blob, right? Well, that doesn't negate the success that they had in their life. And the example you give, people remember this person, right? And they say, yeah, this person did this thing, and that contributes meaningfulness to that life for Wolf. But if in your example there were no previous life that was engaged in a valuable way, then we wouldn't have that judgment, right? So I think Wolf is perfectly sympathetic to your view there and say, yeah, no, there's something still about that life which is very meaningful, even though it came to maybe a tragic conclusion. There's still something we want to say about that in terms of the meaningfulness, and that's because of the kind of engagement in the project of positive value that's to some degree successful, right? If that didn't happen at all, and it were just the blob as we have encountered the blob in the example throughout that person's life, then none of those criteria would be fulfilled. But the example you provided us does fulfill those criteria, even though at some point in the life it no longer does. Well, the fact that it has provides more meaningfulness to the life than if it hadn't met any of those criteria. And I understand there's like kind of a compassion we want to have. It seems harsh to say a life isn't meaningful, right? But again, we need to think about this on a kind of a spectrum, as opposed to a black and white dichotomy. And the point here is to get us thinking about how meaningfulness can be something more than just subjective satisfaction, right? That there's something more here than just arbitrarily saying, hey, that life's meaningful because I think it's meaningful. That relativism about meaning. There really seems to be features of a life that we're tracking. Now, you could disagree with Wolf about some of these criteria, and you might think there are some more criteria as well. The underlying philosophical perspective here is that meaningfulness is something that can come into a life due to the way in which that life is lived. It can also fail to bring meaning into life based upon how the life is lived. And Wolf thinks that we need to recognize this if we want to live meaningful lives. I mean, if that really is a concern of ours, I want my life to be meaningful. Wolf thinks it's important to recognize that the way in which we do live can either bring that meaning into our lives or fail to bring it in. And so recognizing the objective dimension of meaning provides a way of orienting ourselves in the world. Again, I mean, there's room for disagreement here, right? So I'm not suggesting that you have to, strictly meet each of the, I don't even think Wolf is saying this. She's not saying you strictly have to meet each of these criteria. I need my notebook. I'm going to check off whether or not it's engaged, whether or not it's in a project of positive value, and whether or not it's successful. All of these admit of degrees, right? And there's probably more here than we've been able to conceptualize so far. But again, the underlying structure of the perspective, it's the optimist perspective. Hey, meaning is something we can really get at. It's something we really can achieve in our lives. And there's a lot of room here about what a life is going to look like on this view. It's not a cookie cutter mold that Wolf is providing, even though these are sort of strict criteria. It's not like the life has to look exactly one way in order for it to be meaningful. There's many different examples of meaningful lives. The point is to recognize that that's something that can be attained or fail to be attained. Wolf's view, in some sense, is very different from Camus and Nagel's, because Wolf thinks that when we step back and we look at the world objectively, when we do take this sort of objective view, what we see is not a meaningless universe, a universe devoid of value and significance. Wolf thinks what we see is that some lives really do achieve meaningfulness in the way in which they're lived, right? We do find differences in meaningfulness across various lives. So she thinks, in some sense at least, and we have to work out exactly what she means by this, lives can be more or less objectively meaningful, right? It's not just a meaningless, empty universe, as Wolf will argue in the second half of her paper, as she does argue in the second half of her paper. She suggests that what we need to adopt is a framework where we see the universe as filled with value, as being full of different types of meaning and significance that we ought to be attentive to, sensitive to. So what Wolf wants to say is, and this is really her position in a nutshell, is that if we think of meaning and significance as a purely subjective factor, as just an expression of our personal preferences, right? Well, I think this is meaningful, so that's meaningful for me, and that's the end of the story, right? Recall from Camus, when we think that way, right, that actually makes the idea of meaningfulness meaningless, right? It empties it of all of its content, right? If what I say is meaningful for me, and that's the end of the story, then I can choose whatever I want, right, to be meaningful. And so can you. And that means that we could never have any sort of disagreement about what is meaningful or what isn't. We can't say anything about it. And Wolf thinks, hey, but that's not how our judgments about meaningfulness really work. I mean, when we talk about meaningfulness, we're not thinking about this as just something we get to make up or decide. It really is something there in the world that we encounter. And Wolf thinks that if we just think it's a purely subjective preference about what's meaningful to me is meaningful, what's meaningful to you is meaningful, it's entirely subjective, it's entirely relativistic. If we think that, what that actually encourages is a kind of solipsism in regards to meaningfulness and significance. So recall the idea of solipsism from Descartes, all the way back from Descartes, right? One of the charges against Descartes was that if you take the cogito seriously, then all you can know with certainty is the existence of your own self. And that seems to run dangerously close to solipsism, where the view of solipsism is that, hey, all that I can know is myself, right? That's all I know exists. I don't know about the existence of anything else in the universe, right? All I know is that I exist. That's a solipsistic view, right? Well, Wolff thinks a similar danger arises when we think of meaning as a purely subjective preference, because what that does is it shuts down our capacity to actually step outside of our own systems of valuation, our own way of thinking about value, and only acknowledge what we think is meaningful, what's meaningful to us personally from our first person perspective. But Wolff thinks, hey, that's a really narrow view to take, because often what happens is when we step outside of our own way of thinking about things, what we end up seeing is that there are nearly an infinite variety of ways in which value can be instantiated in the universe. So why think that my own subjective preferences are the final say about what really is significant, what really is meaningful? It's kind of a solipsistic view to think that somehow this little tiny speck of dust in the cosmos, me, has an authoritative purchase on what is or isn't meaningful, right? I mean, why think that my subjective preferences are the end all be all about what is or isn't valuable? Wolff thinks that's crazy, right? When you step outside of your first personally engaged perspective, what you find, Wolff thinks, hey, there might even be an infinite number of different perspectives, different possible points of view that beings in the universe have on the world that they exist within. And what that means is that there's possibly an infinite variety of ways in which value and meaning can be instantiated, can be made real in the world. I mean, you might think, for instance, of an alien species, right? Think about an alien species, some imaginary, right? Granted, I mean, there could be such a species, but just for the sake of the thought experiment, some civilization whose mode of life is so foreign to our own that when we encountered it, we wouldn't know exactly how to make sense of it, right? If we wanted to say, hey, meaning just is whatever I take to be meaningful, that's what makes something meaningful, or whatever you take to be meaningful, that actually is a very narrow view and would, Wolff thinks, prevent us from acknowledging the various ways in which meaning can occur in the universe. For instance, to some alien civilization, right? They might have a totally different way of thinking about meaning and significance. And if we just think that our subjective preferences are the end all be all, that shuts down the possibility of saying, hey, maybe I don't have the whole picture. Maybe there are ways of being in the world which I don't currently know about, but which are incredibly meaningful and significant. So Wolff thinks if you acknowledge the objectivity of meaning, that actually allows you to see that the universe is filled with value. And it's the proper response to the fact that we are just tiny specks within this vast universe. Okay, so I jumped ahead a little bit there. That's the overall picture that Wolff is laying out, and we'll try and just gradually work our way there. Okay, so just on the sort of broad nature of a lot of these concepts, they cover many different forms. So projects are to be construed extraordinarily broadly, right? That is, many different types of activities will constitute a project. We often think about a project as a very specific task. So you're working on a cure for cancer, or some scientific discovery, or you're writing a novel or a short story, or composing a piece of music, etc. We often think about these as kinds of projects. But projects for Wolff just are any activity that one puts some investment in. So for example, a relationship is an example of a project for Wolff. You know, what constitutes a successful relationship, that's very open-ended, and Wolff is not giving us any sort of like concrete criteria for what a successful relationship would be, right? I mean, that could be worked out in a number of different ways. And if it's a project, right? So a project can be just about anything that we undertake such that we have some kind of investment in the outcome, right? When we enter into a relationship, for instance, like that's not something that can be purely passive. If you're in a relationship with a significant other or someone you love, that requires some effort, some kind of investment has to be put into it. And again, it can play out in an infinite variety of ways, right? But if it's something that requires that kind of attention and work, then what you've got is a project on your hands, right? And so a project is very broad in that respect, and it needs to be actively engaged in, right? So what is active engagement? Well, for Wolf, this means it's not a project that just keeps you busy, right? It's not the kind of project that you just do because you have to do it, or that because you're doing it just to sort of fill time. Wolf thinks that a project that's actively engaged in is one that you identify with. It's something that you put your whole heart into, right? You have investment in the outcome. You want it to succeed, right? You care about it. That element of care, of attention, of exertion of energy on the activity or the project is what Wolf is here designating as active engagement. The project must engage the person whose life it is, right? So the example of the idle rich person who just flits about and does yoga, shops, etc. That's an example of somebody who's engaged in an activity, but it's not active engagement in Wolf's sense, because the person's heart isn't in it. They're not identified with it. There's nothing on the line for them. So the project needs to be actively engaged, and it needs to be a project of positive value. Okay, so this element of positive value, I think, is the most difficult dimension of Wolf's theory to make sense of. What does it mean for a project to have positive value? Who decides what counts as a positively valuable project to undertake? How do we even know there is such a thing? So this runs into the problem of the objectivity, right? The objectivity of value that Wolf wants to articulate in her view. So what does it mean for a project to be positively valuable? So what Wolf wants to say is that her conception of positive value should be maximally tolerant. She wants it to be maximally tolerant. That is, it should include a wide array of different sorts of projects, even projects which look mutually incompatible from an individual person's point of view. So Wolf here is going to say, look, what has positive value, the concept of positive value, it ought to track just what people tend to think of as having positive value, right? So what exactly does she mean by this? So that's what we need to look at right now. What does Wolf mean when she says that a life which is meaningful needs to be engaged in a project of positive value? What does it mean for a project to have that kind of positive value? Any questions or comments so far before we move into sort of a deeper analysis here of what Wolf means by positive value? Okay, so let's take an example. What does Wolf mean when she says that our concept of positive value needs to be maximally tolerant? So Julie finds little value in sports. In fact, she finds the whole affair somewhat ridiculous, right? Trying to, get some ball to the end of a field and push it across a line, right? She thinks, why do people do this sort of thing? Why are people interested in this sort of thing? Julie spends most of her time writing and reading about obscure and esoteric topics in the philosophy of personal identity, right? So, so Julie finds this project pursuing esoteric topics in philosophy to be what she thinks is worthy of spending her time on, right? She finds those projects to have positive value, those sorts of projects. She looks at sports and she says, I can't understand why anybody would be interested in this nonsense. John, on the other hand, is puzzled by Julie's interests. John much prefers spending his time working on cars and watching football. So Julie and John have different ideas about what does or does not have positive value. I mean, John really just can't see, and maybe you sympathize with this, the positive value in reading and writing about topics in the philosophy of personal identity, right? He just finds this totally bizarre and can't comprehend what motivates Julie to do this. This is sort of the situation that I have when I'm talking with family at like a holiday dinner or something like that, right? Sometimes just this sort of look of puzzlement comes over some of my relatives when I start talking about philosophy. But you know, Julie at the same time just really has a hard time understanding where John's coming from and can't see like why John wants to spend his time doing these things. And that's fine, according to Woolf, right? This sort of difference is to be expected because obviously there are a diverse array of individual perspectives and what they find meaningful in their lives. I mean, this is just a fact about the world we live in that needs to be acknowledged. There are many different types of projects that people find to have positive value. And, you know, from an individual perspective, I might think that one thing has positive value. You might think it has another, and they might be mutually exclusive from each other in some sense. But Woolf thinks that's fine, right? That's okay. There needs to be a diverse array of things that people find to have positive value in order to accommodate the just facts of the world that we live in. All this shows, according to Woolf, is that our concept of what does or does not have positive value is intimately connected to what we think does or does not contribute to a meaningful life, right? So Woolf's point here is that you take the example of John, who works on cars and watches sports. He thinks that doing that contributes to a meaningful life. His concept of what has positive value is also tied into his notion of what will bring meaning into his life. And he might not be able to see how reading and writing on esoteric topics in the philosophy of personal identity is connected to that, but that's fine because what his concept is tracking is what he thinks is meaningful and significant, right? So what we think has positive value is intimately connected to what we think has meaning. And what Woolf wants to say is that, look, if we were wrong about what does or does not have positive value, what that would mean is that we'd also be wrong about what does or does not contribute to a meaningful life. That's what the notion of positive value picks out. It tracks what we think is meaningful. And Woolf wants to say, hey, so if you are deciding on a project, right? You're deciding on some project to undertake in your life. And oftentimes when we make such a decision, when we think about how you want to direct yourself in terms of your individual trajectory, we try and pick out activities that we think are valuable, right? That we think are going to bring some value into our lives such that it would make it more meaningful. And Woolf wants to say, look, this can be different for many people, but what it shows is that if we were wrong about whether or not the project we undertook had positive value, we'd also be wrong about whether or not pursuing that project would bring meaningfulness into our lives, right? So if you undertake some project, you think, hey, I think this project has positive value. And then at some stage in your trajectory, you'd say, I thought this had positive value, but it really doesn't. It's really not bringing meaningfulness into my life. Wolff says that concept of positive value, what it does is it just tracks what our intuitions are about what is or isn't meaningful. And if we were wrong about that, then we'd also be wrong about what is going to bring meaning to our lives or not. Yeah, this is the optimistic view. This is the optimistic view. This is the view which wants to say, hey, meaningfulness is something objective, right? That there is value is in some sense an objective constituent of the cosmos. Okay, so what's Wolff getting at here? I mean, it almost sounds like there is a kind of subjectivity here. What Wolff wants to exclude from her conception of positive value is the idea that it's a merely subjective preference on the part of the person who pursues it, right? So what Wolff wants to make sure, it's a maximally tolerant conception of positive value, such that Julie's project seems to have value for her and John's project seems to have value for him. But what she wants to exclude is the possibility that what really counts as having positive value is whether or not one takes it as having positive value. That's what she wants to exclude from her conception here. What Wolff thinks is that there's always the possibility of getting it wrong. It's a maximally tolerant conception of positive value so that you can have sort of just an infinite array of different projects that have positive value. But Wolff wants to say what we need to exclude from this interpretation is the idea that just because the project seems to you to have positive value, it really in fact does. Why does she think that this is the case? Well, I mean, isn't there the possibility? So let's just imagine, for instance, what the world looks like from the perspective of the corporate executive who is devoting 7 days a week, 12-hour days, 7 days a week to solely to the accumulation of wealth, right? Let's imagine, and it's kind of an artificial example because, you know, maybe not, maybe people's lives are really like this, devoted solely to the accumulation of wealth, right? All of their time dedicated to that. What does the world look like from that perspective, or from this individual's perspective? That individual presumably is going to say, I think this is like what I ought to do, right? This is the course that I ought to take in my life, right? They think, it seems to me they potentially think that what they're doing is correct. It's hard to imagine the person like totally engaged in this project and saying, hey, I don't think this really has any meaning. I mean, maybe that is a possibility, but from the perspective, you think, hey, from the perspective of this individual, they're going to think that what they're pursuing has some kind of positive value to it, right? And what Wolff wants to say is we can't have a conception of positive value which says that just because you think it has positive value, it really does. Why? Well, from the perspective of the corporate executive who's spending all their time accumulating wealth, and again, we have nothing against corporate executives, but just about like the motivation for the project, all the time dedicated to the accumulation of wealth here. From that perspective, what Wolff wants to say is there's got to be a possibility of a kind of epiphany, a kind of an awakening to the fact that maybe one's life to date hasn't been meaningful in the way that it potentially could have been. There needs to be a possibility for one to say, I thought the project that I was undertaking had positive value, but it really doesn't. Now, it doesn't mean that any of the projects that you undertake necessarily don't have positive value or anything like that. What Wolff just wants to say is, look, there's a possibility of getting it wrong. I mean, Ikiru, I think, is just a wonderful example of this, right? A person lives their life in a certain way. And Ikiru, it's the fact, you know, it's his diagnosis of the fact that he has stomach cancer, which finally leads to this like, aha, I need to reevaluate the way in which I'm living my life, right? Wolf wants to say, how could you possibly make sense of an aha moment? Oh, I'm not living my life in a way which is as meaningful as it could be if there weren't the possibility that we could get that wrong, right? So Wolf thinks what we take to have positive value, just because we take something to have positive value, isn't enough to make it have positive value, right? Because we could be wrong about that. And Wolf thinks this is a very important dimension of meaning that we need to recognize, is that there's a way of getting it wrong. If there's a way of getting it wrong, that seems to suggest that there's some kind of objectivity to the matter, right? We could orient ourselves in a life in a way which fails to bring meaning into it. On the same hand, we could orient ourselves in a way which makes it more meaningful. Now, Wolf is not saying, here's what you have to do. I mean, she's given us the very broad criteria, project of positive value that's to some degree successful. Again, that could be many different projects, right? So she's not saying you've got to live your life in this way. She's just saying, hey, there seems to be like something really at stake here. It's not an arbitrary matter. It's not something which is just sort of subjectively, you know, something which is determined by our subjective preferences alone. So whether or not a life really is meaningful depends on more than whether or not a project seems to have positive value from the perspective of the one whose life it is. If a project seeming to have value guaranteed that it did have value, then there would be no need to be interested in what really does or doesn't contribute to a meaningful life. Right? Because you could just say, if I take it to be meaningful, then it's meaningful. Why should you care then? Right? You just decide. You decide, and there's nothing really on the line, because whatever you decide, that's what it is. But Wolf thinks that can't be right. So if you get it wrong, does that defeat the notion of only recognizing the self because someone else is right? I don't think I understand. So if you get it wrong, does that defeat the notion of only recognizing the self?
You had said earlier that she said that she only recognizes like her individual self, right?
No. I said she doesn't. I mean, she's avoiding solipsism.
Oh, okay. I thought you said she was trying to what's it called? Say solicism.
No.
Okay.
No, that's exactly the opposite of what she's trying to say.
I was getting confused. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Wolf wants to say, look, what you subjectively take to be meaningful is not the final say about what is or isn't meaningful. I think that the idea that our subjective preferences determine what's meaningful, I think, is the common modern view. That's what I think most people think about meaning in life. It's just like, whatever you take to be meaningful, hey, that's going to be meaningful for you. Wolf is pushing back on this very common idea. And I agree with her. I think it's actually very mistaken. You might disagree, right? But I think it's mistaken in the sense that it gets people off the hook. It allows you to not have to think deeply about meaning. If you can just say, hey, whatever you take it to be, that's it, right? That seems to me a very superficial view, right? Which doesn't adequately acknowledge the fact that, hey, I think most people who even make judgments like that, who express a view like that, they then judge some lives as being more meaningful than other lives. And so the philosophical relativism that they express actually doesn't cohere with the way in which they act on meaning in their lives, right? Because, I mean, if you think that it's just your subjective preferences, then there's really no reason to care. Because there's nothing on the line, right? Whatever you decide, that's it. That's the end of the story. But that doesn't seem to be how meaning in life works. It seems that we can live in a way which isn't meaningful. Or on the other hand, live in a way which is more meaningful. And that seems to suggest that there's something beyond merely just my subjective preferences involved here. Colby, go ahead.
So is it kind of like the idea that because we can imagine a meaningless life, that we can
Yeah.
like observe that there has to be an opposite, right?
Yeah, that's one. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. Yeah, because we can imagine the possibility of a life without meaning, that suggests that there is. So when we imagine a life without meaning, we're imagining a life where certain facts are the case, right? There are certain facts in that life which contribute to it being less meaningful than it could be. And what that thought suggests is that we could imagine that life in a different way, such that other facts were present in that life, which conferred more meaning on that life. Yeah, we can imagine its meaninglessness. That means that conversely, right, we can imagine a life with meaning. Yeah, so I think that's a nice way of putting it. So if a project seeming to have value guaranteed that it did have value, I'd never have to care about whether or not what I'm doing is meaningful, right? So what Wolf wants to say is, look, how can we imagine this state of affairs? Have you ever had an experience? So this is a question to all of you, right? Have you ever had an experience where there was something, I don't know, something in your life, some way you were living your life, let's say, and you didn't recognize the value of something, right? I'm just keeping it very broad at the present moment. You didn't recognize the value of something. There's maybe some activity that certain people in your life engaged in, and you just said, I don't think there, you just weren't interested in it. You didn't find any value in it. And suddenly at some point or at some stage, you began to recognize that value, that project or that activity as having value, as being meaningful in a way in which you didn't previously recognize it, right? So kind of a change comes over you, kind of a psychological transformation of sorts, where you suddenly now appreciate this activity or project in a way in which you previously didn't. How do you account for that change, right? I mean, it seems like when a change like that occurs, you're suddenly perceiving the value in the activity that you didn't previously perceive. Now, if the subjective view are correct, in the earlier stage where you said it doesn't have value, that would be the case. It doesn't have any value. But then how do you make sense of the transformation? How do you make sense of the shift in perspective where you don't see it as value and then suddenly you come to see it? I mean, if you've spent any time trying to understand artistic works of art, for instance, yeah, this takes work. I mean, you have to kind of train yourself. You have to educate yourself oftentimes to perceive the value in a good work of art, right? I mean, if you look at a Picasso for the very first time, you just say, hey, these are a bunch of cubes and undecipherable shapes that don't make any sense to me. But if you spend some time studying the work of art, suddenly a whole deeper dimension of creativity and philosophical expression begins to emerge, right? And you really do seem to start to see something that you couldn't previously see. So, I mean, there's a possibility. Imagine that you live in a world, for instance, where nobody in your environment values artistic creation. And you just kind of, you go about your life thinking there's nothing valuable there. I mean, wouldn't you be missing out on something? Is the fact that you just take it to not have any value, does that really mean it doesn't have any value? I mean, is that the end of the story? Because it seems to me like oftentimes we've got to be attentive to the possibility that something is valuable that we don't currently understand as having value, right? I mean, I encounter this all the time with philosophy. A lot of people come to philosophy and they say, hey, there's nothing valuable here, right? This is a waste of time. A lot of people say that about philosophy. A lot of people, it's actually kind of common. It's kind of crazy to my mind because like Western civilization is based in the philosophical traditions which founded, our culture, right? So we're constantly embedded in the philosophical ideas that people brought into the world at a very early time. But nonetheless, a lot of people are oblivious to this fact. And they think there's nothing valuable there. I think personally, they're missing something, right? They're not seeing something which is actually present in their lives. So it seems to me there's the possibility that we can get things wrong here, right? We can be mistaken about what is valuable and what isn't valuable.
It's kind of hard to explain.
Yeah, no, I like that. There's a feeling like, like, and maybe this is part of the feeling of the absurd that that creeps in, that kind of perpetual possibility for doubt that Nagel was talking about. It's like, well, Wolf wants to say maybe part of the reason why we feel that is because we recognize that we might get it wrong. And that brings a kind of existential angst with it, a kind of a feeling of concern, maybe even of anxiety. But it's a really important form of anxiety because it's a form of anxiety which helps us orient ourselves, which helps us say, I'm going to put energy and attention into living a meaningful life. Like I'm going to make this an active element of how I orient myself in the world. Pupak, go ahead.
There's something that I cannot understand about the project that should be successful and have meaning, something like the relationship or starting a family. It is a positive thing and a meaningful thing, but it doesn't guarantee that it will be successful because there is two persons involved in it. One person put every effort to for it to work, but there is no guarantee that it will work.
Yeah.
So how about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, I think it's the most, to my mind, it's actually maybe the most controversial aspect of Wolf's view. So let's you and I assume for the sake of argument here, you've got two people in a relationship and it really is a project of positive value, right? The intentions of the people entering into the relationship aren't duplicitous. There's a possibility of consummating a genuine human connection there, which would really be valuable for both of the people involved. I think relationships are actually a great example of projects that do really have positive value. I mean, Wolf is still like, there's a lot that goes on in thinking about positive value there, but so let's just assume it does have positive value. That's, I think, kind of what you're saying, Pupak. And then the question is, what if it's not successful? Like, what if the relationship fails, right?
Yes.
Wolf wants to say if it fails, that makes it less meaningful than if it were successful. So she wants to say the success of a project of positive value is a really important condition in whether or not it ultimately ends up being meaningful. Now, so does that make sense? I mean, that's Wolf's view. That's what she's saying.
Okay.
She's saying that is an important component in whether or not it ultimately ends up being meaningful. So a project can have positive value,
Okay.
like the relationship. But if it fails, Wolf wants to say it's not as meaningful as it could have been.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It doesn't make sense to me, but
why doesn't it make sense?
I don't know. It's difficult to explain. Something is meaningful or not. It cannot be meaningful at first, and then you put every effort to work, and then at the end you figure it out that it's not meaningful. It doesn't make sense for me.
Okay, so you want to say it's got to be okay, right? So you want to say, hey, if the project has positive value, then it's meaningful. It's meaningful whether or not you succeed at it or not. Maybe in some sense that's true. Maybe the project is a meaningful project, but whether or not that meaning is conferred on one's life right? Whether or not one sort of actualizes the meaning of the project, embodies it, has to do, at least partially, in whether or not the project is successful, right? So you can say, hey, that's a meaningful project to engage in, right? The relationship, if I pursued, the decades-long relationship with this person, that would be a meaningful project. And at the same time say that, hey, if it's not ultimately successful, the project could have still been meaningful in some sense, right? But the meaning that it confers on my life is lessened if the success has not occurred.
Okay.
And I think so that's the idea. And I think you can say the project's meaningful. Now I have to pursue it, right? I think it's meaningful. Like, this is a part of the determination we have to make. It's a difficult one to do, right? Because there's always a little bit of doubt when we undertake projects. Like, is this really going to be meaningful? But let's say you make the determination it is meaningful, and you're right about that. I think we can do that. Now we have to follow through, right? Now some activity on our part is required in order to bring that meaning into our lives, in order to sort of make that meaningful project one which constitutes our life. And that's where we could either succeed or fail to succeed, according to Wolf.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. And then the question is, how big of a role does success play with that question? Because you might think, even if the relationship fails, like, that doesn't totally negate the meaning that the project has. And I think that's probably right. But I think it is contingent upon what you go and do from there, right? Like, whether that sort of brings some other sort of like perspective or value orientation into the individual
Yes,
life.
my point was it is not only dependent on me. It is dependent on the other person too.
Yeah.
It was my point.
Yeah. Well, yes, right. And I think this is a dimension of the project which makes it very broad. Is a project doesn't necessarily even have to be just something that I alone, the individual, am doing. I mean, the project could be undertaken between multiple people, right? It could be a communal project of sorts. I mean, lots of projects are like this, right? Political projects are like this. They don't just involve the individual, but they involve a community of people. And being involved in that, that does involve it gets complicated there,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, it does. It gets complicated and messy very quickly. Yeah. So I think that's a great comment. So let's pursue this a little bit further here. Oops. Wolf writes, what I have in mind is the possibility of a kind of epiphany. So what Wolf is saying here is, hey, we wouldn't be able to make sense of an example like this in the absence of something having positive value actually being dependent upon something more than my subjective preferences. We wouldn't be able to make make sense of an example like this. She writes, what I have in mind is the possibility of a kind of epiphany in which one wakes up, literally or figuratively, to the recognition that one's life to date has been meaningless. Such an experience would be nearly unintelligible if a lack of meaning were to be understood as a lack of a certain kind of subjective impression. One can hardly understand the idea of waking up to the thought that one's life to date has seemed meaningless. To the contrary, it may be precisely because one did not realize the emptiness of one's projects or the shallowness of one's values until that moment that the experience I am imagining has the poignancy it does. So again, I'm going to try and bring you back to whether or not you've ever had a kind of experience like this, or you've known somebody who's had a kind of experience like this, where there's some activity or way of life that they don't find valuable as having any value, and then suddenly wake up to the fact that, hey, maybe it does. maybe it actually does. Maybe I was wrong about that. Wolf wants to say that epiphany, that realization, which then catalyzes a transformation in behavior, we can't make sense of that in the absence of there being something about meaningfulness which isn't dependent merely upon my subjective preferences. There's got to be some objective fact that we're becoming attuned to when we wake up, when we have the epiphany, something that we're seeing that we weren't previously seeing. And this can happen in our lives when we go through our life. Maybe the corporate executive, right, has this epiphany at some moment where they say, wait a second, just working to accumulate more wealth is going to be meaningless. And they say, I need to change things. I mean, this happens to people. Okay, so I'm going to move through some of this actually really quickly here. So to care about meaning, right? To care about meaning in one's life is to care about whether the projects I am actively and somewhat at least successfully engaged in really do have positive value, right? That caring, it seems hard to make sense of caring in the absence of there being some fact of the matter here. So it doesn't seem to be enough that a life seems to have value. We want to know whether or not it really does. I'm going to move through some of this quickly here. I mean, just think about people, the lengths to which people go to try and make their lives meaningful. Like, think about the market around self-help material, right? The seminars, retreats, books, manuals. It's a huge industry, right? People really do care about this. And again, I have nothing against self-help manuals, by the way. I think with the right perspective, those can actually be really useful. But oftentimes, right, they're just, marketed to people because it is a fact that people care about this, right? And, people want their lives to be meaningful. But Wolf thinks that it's not only a fact about people, it's also something people should want. It's a good thing to want one's life to be meaningful. In fact, somebody who doesn't care about meaning, Wolf thinks that there's a problem there. People ought to care about their lives being meaningful. Now, a question arises if you take that view, what's good about living a meaningful life? Why should we care about that? And Wolf wants to say, hey, look, it's not the same as living a moral life, right? Because there's a distinction between living a good life in the moral sense and living a good life in the meaningful sense. There's a difference between winning a gold medal and donating to charity. Like, those seem to be different types of goodness that we could care about. Sometimes achieving meaning can also require the sacrifice of personal happiness, right? So the tortured artist, the political revolutionary. What's good about living a meaningful life isn't necessarily that it's a moral good, that's morally good, or even that it makes us happy, right? It can be something distinct from that. So it's not clear that living a meaningful life is even better for the person whose life it is. I mean, the political revolutionary, right, could end in the loss of life eventually, right? And it can be a meaningful life even though it goes against the preservation of that individual biologically. So it seems like something else is going on there. Even we still seem to care about meaning even in the absence of sometimes moral goodness, right? I mean, you can maybe think of examples of artists. There are a number of them whose lives might seem to be meaningful, but who were sort of lacking in the moral dimension. Wolf gives some examples in the text if you want to look further into that. And it could also be a life which doesn't involve a kind of personal happiness, which lacks that subjective dimension of satisfaction, and for it to still be meaningful, right? So what's good about living a meaningful life? That's the question that Wolf wants to address here. So here's this. I think this is a good example. Okay, So let's take a look at this. If, for example, you see a person you care about conducting her life in a way that you find devoid of worth, she is addicted to drugs, perhaps, or just television, or she is overly enthusiastic in her career as a corporate lawyer, you are apt to encourage her to change, or at least hope that she will find a new direction on her own. You fear that at some point she will wake up to the fact that she has been wasting or misdirecting her life, a point that may come too late for easy remedy and will, in any case, involve a lot of pain and self-criticism. But the fear that she will wake up to the fact that she has been wasting her life may not be as terrible as the fear that she won't wake up to it. We seem to think she should want meaning in her life, my emphasis there, even if she doesn't realize it. Have you ever known someone like this who you look at their life? I mean, they may be somebody you're personally connected to, and you say, like the way in which you're conducting your life, a person you care about probably, the way in which that person is conducting their life is one which you think, man, if you just change the way in which you did things, right? Maybe the person is addicted to drugs, they've got a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, or even in this case, like television, or the overly enthusiastic business person, right? And you think if you changed the way in which you live your life, that would be good. That would be good for you. And can we imagine cases like that? Have you ever known somebody who you thought, hey, maybe if you just changed a little the way in which you oriented yourself, that would be good for you? I mean, maybe even you've had this experience with yourself, right? Maybe if I changed this sort of pattern of behaviors that I'm engaged in, that would be a good thing. So, I mean, watch Ikiru, right? I mean, imagine the life of this person, Watanabe, who wakes up to this fact. Imagine that life in the absence of such an awakening, and ask yourself, is that better or worse? I mean, maybe you really do think it doesn't matter at all, right? I mean, that is a kind of sort of a deep nihilism about meaning, that just really, there's nothing there that is ultimately meaningful. But Wolf wants to say, it seems like we think there's something good about waking up, about being attentive to what does actually have value. And that's something we should want. And the difficulty here is, how do you justify that, right? I mean, from the philosophical perspective, it's very difficult to do. How do you justify that? How do you justify that this is something you should want? All I've been pointing to are certain, I think, what are maybe psychological facts that we can wake up to what will bring value to our lives or not. But the question is, like, what's really there? What's really going on there underneath the hood, so to speak, to use a mechanical metaphor? How does that work? How is our judgments about meaningfulness hooking in to the way the world is actually constituted? Yeah.
I guess I was just thinking about I'm not sure if I have the right word for it, but something like peer pressure. I'm imagining, like, so you have goals that you want to aspire to based on what the group thinks, and then you constantly find yourself inadequate and unable to achieve those goals. Therefore, you don't find meaning or value in your own life, because you are constantly striving to achieve what you believe is the standard that other people have.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's great. Wouldn't that be a case then in which you are wrong about what actually has positive value? Like you're thinking, I'm not saying you, but the example you gave of somebody who's in such a situation, right? In a case like that, this person is saying, well, if I just conform to these social standards, maybe it's standards about the things I ought to own, the kind of car I drive, or how I look, or maybe even like how intelligent, what kind of school I go to, how intelligent I am, the kind of thing I do for a living. And you think it's got to fit these criteria that are set by the group in order for me to live a meaningful life. And then this person finds themselves continually not able to meet these standards and unsatisfied. And then the question is, well, is their wanting their life to be meaningful in that way actually a bad thing, right? That's your point. Like, could that actually be a bad thing which hurts somebody? Well, I suppose in that sense it could, but why would that be the case? Maybe because the person doesn't actually have a conception of what is positive value, what is positively valuable in the context of their life, right? They've set up this false standard of what has positive value, and it's meeting these criteria that they've been peer pressured into. And in some sense, right, they're not adequately understanding what really would bring meaning. They're getting it wrong. And Wolf wants to say, like, look, I mean, that's a danger. It's always going to be a danger. And not caring about, so I think Wolf thinks it's even better to fail at achieving meaning than to not care at all, right? Because what's the other option there? Is just to say, oh, well, I don't care. I mean, in some sense, you're still going to be pressured by the group, even if you don't care about meaning, because then you're just going to say, hey, well, I'll accept blindly what the group says really does have positive value. I mean, you're in a dangerous situation there too, right? So Wolf wants to say, hey, we need to direct our philosophical attention to this, like in our own lives, not just theoretically, not just in the abstract, but we need to think critically in our own lives about what will bring meaning or not. And there's always the possibility of getting it wrong. That is an existential risk, Wolf thinks. But that's why it requires that kind of serious attention, because it's a serious matter. Because there's really something on the line. So we think that people should want meaning in their life. Could this wanting meaning lead people astray? Certainly. I mean, think about the way in which people go to, I don't know, like a yoga guru, right? And they think, if I just devote myself to this individual, maybe that will make my life meaningful. And we've got all these examples of, like, spiritual gurus who then take advantage of their students, right? Monetarily, even sexually sometimes. And it turns out to be a fraud. I mean, the person wanting meaning there led them into a not so great situation, right? But that's because, we can get it right or we can get it wrong. And that's why it requires the kind of attention that Wolf is encouraging here, is because when we want it, we should want it because ultimately it's a good thing, but it's not an entirely arbitrary thing. So there's really something at stake there. I don't know if I explained that as clearly as I potentially could, but that's the general idea there. So why should we care about living a meaningful life? One answer is simply self-interest, like, because it would be good for me to do that. But is that really all that's at stake? Might there be something outside myself that grounds this should, why I should care? So a person who lives their life solely in the pursuit of their own subjective fulfillment, Wolf thinks seems to be missing some important fact about the kind of universe we live in. Wolf thinks that when a person just lives their life according to their own subjective fulfillment, they miss the fact that we are just tiny specks in the vast universe. They miss the fact that the way in which we think about value is just one possible way of thinking about value. They miss the fact that a universe like ours may contain countless, maybe even infinite perspectives of equal status to our own. And from this perspective, focusing solely on our own subjective satisfaction seems gratuitous, misguided, or even silly. why should we think that we have an authoritative purchase on what is and isn't meaningful? So this is the idea I was trying to outline for you at the very beginning of the lecture today, is that Wolf thinks if we think that our subjective preferences are what determine whether something is meaningful or isn't, this is to fail to recognize that we are just tiny specks in a vast universe full of a variety of perspectives who can see value in possibly different ways than we are currently seeing it from our own subjective perspective. And to think that our subjective perspective is the authoritative standard for what is or isn't meaningful, right? That our subjective preference is the standard, full stop, is to miss the fact that there are an infinite variety of ways in which value is instantiated in the world. If we recognize that we are just tiny specks in a vast universe, Wolf thinks that we awaken to the fact that there might be values and meanings and significance beyond what we are currently grasping. Yeah, that's how she makes sense of the epiphany, the waking up to the fact that there may be forms of life that we don't currently recognize as valuable, which really are. To think that our subjective preferences are the sole standard is a kind of solipsism about meaning. It's not to it's to miss the kind of universe that we live in. When we see that just because something seems to be meaningful to us doesn't mean that it really is. We can be wrong about that. And this allows us to step back from our knee-jerk reactions, from our just subjective preferences, and ask, is this really meaningful? And Wolf thinks that when we do this, what we do is we accept a framework that recognizes distinctions in non-subjective value. When we say, is this really meaningful? What we're doing is we're stepping back and we're accepting a philosophical framework, a conceptual framework, which recognizes distinctions in value that aren't merely subjective. And Wolf thinks that that is a more accurate way of thinking about the universe, that there really are distinctions in value, that some things are objectively better than other things, that's possible, right? I mean, you can't, well, maybe I shouldn't say you can't, right? But Wolf thinks that it doesn't make sense to recognize distinctions in value if there really aren't distinctions in value. To step back from our own subjective preferences and say, is this really meaningful, is to accept a view of the world where there are distinctions in value, where some things are more valuable than other things. And she says, for instance, a human being is better than a mosquito, it's more valuable than a mosquito. A Vermeer painting is better than scraps on a compost heap. It's an example from the text. So Wolf thinks there really are distinctions. Some things are more valuable than other things. And maybe that's the hard point to sort of get here. So you might think, for instance, wait a second, if we say some things are better than other things, isn't that preferencing our own subjective view, right? If we say a human being is better than a mosquito, isn't that a sort of a contradiction? Isn't it contradicting the fact that we're just tiny specks in the vastness of the universe? Wolf doesn't think it is, because she thinks that when we recognize that we're just tiny specks, what we do is become attentive to the fact that there are many different ways in which value can be instantiated in the world. And some things will be more valuable than other things when we step back from our own subjective preferences. Then we can really begin to see more clearly what is valuable or what isn't. Now, I think for Wolf, there's like a perpetual possibility of getting things wrong here, which is important. And it's a continual existential effort to become more attentive to the sources of value in one's life. But to adopt the merely subjective preference view, right, or the view that there is no meaning, is to just sort of give up on that project altogether. And Wolf thinks that that would be a bad thing. That would be bad for us if we stopped caring about meaning. So Wolf writes, I am suggesting that we can have a reason to do something or to care about something that is grounded not in our own psychologies, nor specifically in our own desires, but in a fact about the world itself. The fact in question in this case, the fact that we are, each of us, specks in a vast and value-filled universe, and that as such, we have no privileged position as a source or processor of objective value, right? So the source of value is not something which is determined by our subjective preferences. And that's what we see when we step back. And that's how her view differs from Nagel's and Camus', is she thinks when we step back, we really see distinctions in non-subjective value. Like they're there in the world. Again, this is a difficult philosophical view to articulate. So when we take the backward step, what do we see? That if God doesn't exist, then life as a whole has no meaning, right? It's got no purpose as a whole. But is that all that we see? Wolf thinks we see that the universe is filled with value that is not dependent on our individual psychologies, right? Which is independent of our desires. And to be attentive to that is to see the world as full of values, is to adopt a framework in which we recognize distinctions in non-subjective value.